that brings us to Joseph Bosco, who has served in the Defense Department in the Office of Secretary of Defense, among other things, as the country desk officer for China. And he has been working in subsequent years at places like the Wilson Center and at the Atlantic Council. And we've asked him to specifically talk about a project that he worked on, as I understand it, during his years in the Pentagon as well, namely North Korea. And specifically, what China is doing to enable the threat with which we are all very much seized, increasingly now posed by North Korea against our country. Joseph Bosco, welcome. Also a member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. Glad to have you, sir.
Thank you, Frank. This will be a less than 10-minute history lesson. As you know, the Korean War was the result of a colossal misunderstanding. In the months leading up to June 1950, the Truman administration made several statements indicating that Washington did not consider either South Korea or Formosa within America's Pacific defense perimeter. North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung, abetted by his allies Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin, saw not a red line, but a green light, and they made their plans to take both the rest of the peninsula and the island. But Kim moved before Mao and invaded South Korea. Truman awoke to the danger, sent the 7th Fleet back into the Taiwan Strait, and mobilized the United Nations to authorize a U.S.-led defense. As Henry Kissinger has written, we didn't expect the invasion, China didn't expect our response. The Korean War was on, and it ended 3 years later, not as the communist aggressors had anticipated, but in a stalemate at the 38th parallel, where it had started. The United States and North Korea both learned their lessons from this experience. In 1954, the Eisenhower administration signed identical mutual defense treaties with the Republic of Korea and the Republic of China on Taiwan. And the U.S. Navy stayed in the Taiwan Strait for the next couple of decades until President Nixon withdrew it to show good faith toward Mao Zedong before they met in 1972. Kim Il-sung also learned a lesson, that America would intervene effectively to defend the South if the prevailing correlation of forces remained as it was. So he decided to change by building a deterrent to keep the U.S. out of the next Korea conflict. And that deterrent was nuclear weapons and the ballistic missiles to deliver them. He began pursuing that goal within a year of the end of the war, and first approached the Soviets without initial success. China, however, was not at all aghast at the prospect of nuclear proliferation on the Korean Peninsula, contrary to what Kissinger and others have argued for decades. Beijing was perfectly willing to funnel its own nuclear technology to Pyongyang through Pakistan's AQ Khan network. It was not the first or the last time that China played the role of WMD proliferator, or indeed as a proliferator of other proliferators. 2 years after it was clear that Pyongyang was serious about its nuclear program, Washington deployed tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea. The North Korean effort proceeded apace for the next several decades, always with a helping hand from Beijing. By the early 1990s, the international community realized it had a serious North Korea problem, and pressure for negotiations began in earnest. To support its communist ally, China proposed the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, a phrase we've heard very recently in the talks between Trump and Kim. At that time, President George H.W. Bush obliged by unilaterally withdrawing its U.S. tactical nuclear weapons from South Korea. Needless to say, Pyongyang simply forged ahead with its program with China's support. This was the reverse of the strategy President Reagan had employed when the Soviets placed SS-20 missiles in Eastern Europe. In his response, he deployed Pershing and cruise missiles to Western Europe. Moscow recognized it had met its match and agreed to a mutual withdrawal of missiles in the INF Treaty. Reagan showed that in that case, we had to arm in order to get the other side to disarm. Over the next 2 decades, there ensued a number of multilateral negotiations with North Korea, six-party talks, the agreed framework, and so on. Throughout those proceedings, China, and to a lesser extent Russia, was always there at North Korea's side, holding its brief, demanding that the U.S. make unilateral concessions, asserting that North Korea was basically America's problem and that we had to find a way to guarantee Pyongyang's long-term security. The same pattern prevailed whenever the Security Council considered censoring and sanctioning North Korea for its violations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and other international laws. China, followed by Russia, could be counted on to act as Pyongyang's lawyer, constantly delaying and watering down the Council's language, and then undermining whatever came out of the process. Beijing and Moscow have always done just enough to show the West that their own good faith, but never enough to actually incentivize North Korea to halt its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Meanwhile, those programs accelerated far ahead of what international experts predicted, with each nuclear test or missile firing surprising the world and the expert community. And China continued to facilitate that development, not only diplomatically, but also by providing material and technological support. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta told the Senate Intelligence Committee in 2007 that China was transferring highly critical missile technology to North Korea and had been doing so for some time. And of course, Beijing continued to prop up the disastrous North Korean economy, supplying essential food and fuel to sustain the Kim regime, its elite supporters, and the North Korean military. Cutting off that economic lifeline would have led to the collapse of North Korea's economy. Even simply threatening to do so would have given Beijing enormous leverage over Pyongyang and the ability to pressure it to comply with international law on nuclear and missile armaments, if Beijing was serious about denuclearization. Meanwhile, the stream of op-eds and speeches from Kissinger and others continued to urge the West to follow the concessionary strategy advocated by China, because, they said, it shared our concerns regarding nuclear weapons in North Korea, and because it was in the best position to understand its volatile neighbor's needs and motivations. Western governments largely deferred to Beijing's self-serving counsel. Yet during all these years, China never delivered as the North Korea problem festered and metastasized. If, as our experts kept telling us, Beijing was as worried as the rest of the world about nuclear weapons in North Korea, why did it not apply serious pressure to get North Korea to come into compliance? The answer is now clear to most non-expert observers. China does not and never has shared our concern about North Korea's nuclear weapons program. On the contrary, the program has served Beijing's strategic interests masterfully in the following important ways. First, North Korea has been a massive strategic and diplomatic distraction and diversion of resources for the West, with its escalating threat reaching existential proportions despite a quarter century of Groundhog Day negotiations. Second, the West was periodically maneuvered into providing significant humanitarian food and fuel assistance to help prop up China's impoverished ally. Third, the North Korean crisis has enabled China to play the role of responsible stakeholder and good faith partner in Western eyes, rewarding it with invaluable but unearned international prestige. Fourth, China's perceived indispensability to a North Korea solution has given it huge negotiating leverage over the West on other disputed issues, such as trade, Taiwan, South China Sea, and human rights. Finally, the successful China-North Korea good cop, bad cop strategy has weakened U.S. counterproliferation efforts, particularly with Iran, providing yet another strategic distraction very useful for diverting attention from what China was doing during all this time. For China, then, North Korea has been the gift that keeps on giving. That would explain Xi Jinping's last-minute intervention before the first Trump-Kim meeting, which seemed to promise a breakthrough. This, despite years of Beijing telling Washington that North Korea is a bilateral issue for it to solve. After that Xi-Kim meeting, North Korea's negotiating posture perceptibly stiffened with a series of old-style insults against the president's national security team, in an obvious attempt to isolate the president from his savvy advisors. As President Trump recently noted, China is presently undermining the existing sanctions, but he said it's okay. Beijing clearly does not want to lose the strategic asset that a nuclear North Korea has been for it. As this committee's mission statement warns, even getting a solid trade agreement with China will not by itself resolve the broad array of issues on which it is challenging the United States and the international order. North Korea is one of those, and that is not okay.